Hello everybody and welcome to the Whiskey Dictionary. Tonight I'm going to be talking to you about Pikesville Rye. This is a straight rye whiskey bottled at 55% ABV, and it is made by Heaven Hill, but it was not always that way. Back in 1895, L. Winnenden Brothers Distillery, they ended up making this whiskey in Scotts Level, Maryland, and they dubbed it Pikesville after the adjacent town. Now historians kind of think that they didn't go with the Scotts Level because it sounds a little bit too much like Scotch, but the facts are lost to time. So, like most whiskeys that were available in the early 1900s, this was killed by Prohibition. But in 1933, when that was repealed, about 3 years later, they were bought by Monumental Distillery, which ended up moving over to Baltimore. But they did maintain the recipe that kept this and made this great. So this ends up being the only Maryland-style rye whiskey in the US, to my knowledge, still currently. So decades later, Heaven Hill ended up buying the brand, and Heaven Hill makes good stuff. I mean, you guys probably saw my video on larceny recently, but everything that they make, everything they touch tends to be pretty good, so this is in good hands. That being said, I want to touch on another point that I made a minute ago. So Pikesville Rye is a Maryland-style rye whiskey. Now there are a couple different styles. There's Maryland style, which tends to be a little bit more delicate, and then there's Philadelphia style, which is kind of that burn that you usually get, and usually when I'm reviewing whiskeys, that's more what I'm drinking. So it tends to be a little bit spicier. This particular whiskey, the mash bill for it is 51% rye and 39% corn and 10% malted barley. And it has to be aged for 6 years. And you're gonna see when I'm going over the nose that even at 51% rye, it's very delicate. So speaking of which, let's go into the nosing and the tasting. All right, so I'm gonna give it a little swirl, kind of open it up a little bit. All right. All right, first thing that I'm getting here is cherry, actually, and I love that. It's whenever I get cherry out of a rye or a bourbon or something like that, it always reminds me of a Manhattan, or just, it kind of always gives me that impression, and I love Manhattans. So first thing I'm getting is cherry. Then I'm following that up with oak, but it's not as harsh of an oak as you often get. It's more of just a subtle wood kind of nose. There's also a very gentle spice, which is that Maryland type style rye whiskey. It's very, very delicate kind of rye. I mean, you guys have had ryes before. The spicy notes that you get, tame them down about 50%, and that's what this is like. All right. Also getting some cinnamon and a little bit of green apple in there, but those are pretty far back. All right, let's go ahead and give this a taste. Cheers. All right, that confirms it. So let me kind of go into this for a minute. Back when I was first tasting this, like months and months and months ago, I did my usual nosing and tasting notes. And I had just finished drinking a cherry Coke right before I had this because I wanted to have a little bit more energy. I was kind of fading, it was a long day at work or whatever. And I remember drinking a cherry Coke, and I remember writing down my notes here. And I just assumed that the cherry Coke was influencing the taste. So I wrote cherry, and then I wrote like sweetness, like Coke, and I actually even put, this might be because of the Coke I had. But trying it now, I'm not gonna say it tastes like cherry Coke because that sounds terrible. And even if I were, it would only be in the best of ways. But what it has is a cherry flavor and then kind of a sweetness that you would typically get from a Coke. It doesn't have the cola flavor. It's just cherry and sweet. And anyway, I thought that was very interesting. It's not something that you pick up very often. So outside of that, despite the cherry Coke, you're also getting vanilla and surprisingly no burn. I was amazed the first time that I had this at the lack of burn when you taste this, because when you think rye, especially 110 proof, you are not thinking no burn, but that's what this gives you. All right, so let's go into kind of the overall here. Well, those of you who have watched the channel for a while know that I love Pikesville Rye. It is something I've bought several bottles of at this point, so it's almost a little bit unfair to give it anything other than a stock it in my mind, because I literally stock it. But for all of you out there, I give it a very solid buy it. I think this is something that you should try. Anybody who watches It's Bourbon Night, they love this as well. It's one of Sarah's favorites, and actually I did a live stream with both of them, and this is one of the things that we drank together. So they think highly of it, and just other whiskey tubers in general all think pretty highly of this whiskey. So it's a very safe bet, and it's fairly inexpensive. So that would be my suggestion. I think it's a solid buy it, if not a stock it. So thank you for joining me here on this episode of the Whiskey Dictionary, and I hope you have a great rest of your night. Cheers.